welcome to This Explainer. We all love celebrating those larger-than-life legends of American history. But what actually happens when we dig into the complex, messy facts that we usually forget? Today, we're taking a magnifying glass to some deeply ingrained American stories and comparing them to the documented history. From the founding of the nation all the way to the Roaring '20s, we're going to trace a really fascinating evolution, looking at exactly how hard facts get twisted, romanticized, and ultimately engineered into the myths we all know today. Like a certain famous fictional archaeologist once said, real cultural heritage belongs in a museum. Why? Because the actual historical truth is often buried deep under Hollywood-style myths. Pop culture just has this way of turning a complicated reality into clear-cut, easily digestible narratives. But real history? It's usually far more complicated, and honestly, a whole lot more interesting. So here is our agenda for today. Artifacts and American myths, engineering the Washington legend, the Alamo's complex reality, the birth of the Wild West, Chicago's infamous gangster era, and finally, history beyond the legend. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Artifacts and American Myths, Uncovering the Truth. When we actively anchor our stories to physical items and places, we start to see the seams in the stories we've been told. Physical artifacts, whether we're talking about a centuries-old document, an early photograph, or even the actual foundations of a building, they don't have an agenda. They just simply exist as proof of what was. Throughout this explainer, we're going to rely heavily on the historical record to peel back those layers of mythology. So get ready to see the heroes and villains you thought you know in a completely different light. Moving right along to Section 2, Engineering the Washington Legend, the Calculated Hero. Okay, jumping back to the 1770s, we find our first example of a completely self-engineered myth. There is a totally stark contrast between George Washington's actual military record and his enduring reputation as a flawless tactical genius. In reality, Washington actually lost more battles than he won during the Revolutionary War. His early military career even included a pretty disastrous campaign in the Ohio River Valley. Yet, his legacy today is that of the unbeatable, stoic father of his country. So how did he bridge that massive gap? Well, he understood that his greatest weapon wasn't perfection on the battlefield. It was resilience, moral authority, and the incredibly careful curation of his own public image. He was a big, powerful guy who deliberately used his imposing physical presence, strict self-command, and genuine modesty to convince a very fearful nation that he could be completely trusted with power. Think about it. When Washington showed up to the Continental Congress, he arrived in full military uniform, signaling he was ready to lead. But then, when he was actually offered the command, he publicly stated he didn't think he was up to the task and famously refused a salary, asking only to have his expenses covered. In an era that was absolutely terrified of military tyrants, Washington expertly performed the role of the reluctant, self-sacrificing Republican leader, and that really cemented his own legend. Now for Section 3, the Alamo's complex reality, the romanticized martyrs. Jumping forward to the 1830s, we encounter the Alamo. Now, this is a prime example of a politically engineered myth, where a military defeat was strategically spun to ignite the Texas Revolution. Just picture the actual Alamo Chapel in 1849, a stark, battle-scarred ruin, long before Hollywood sets completely reshaped our collective memory of what it looked like. The famous battle in 1836 lasted for 2 weeks, ending with the Mexican army overrunning the small Texan garrison. It was a brutal, total defeat. But remember, the Alamo quickly became the political rallying cry that helped Texas win its independence just weeks later at the Battle of San Jacinto. But the myth-making definitely didn't stop there. Instead of just a few lone Anglo heroes fighting for freedom, the reality on the ground was so much more complex. The defenders actually included crucial Tejano combatants, Hispanic residents of Texas, and non-combatants whose stories were largely overshadowed by racial prejudice in later historical accounts. On top of that, historians point out that the Texas Revolution was heavily driven by pro-slavery sentiment against a Mexican government that had prohibited it. This historical site remains a point of really intense cultural debate today, perfectly demonstrating how history is continually contested and rewritten depending on who is holding the pen. All right, Section 4, Birth of the Wild West, the sensationalized outlaw. Heading into the 1870s, the Lincoln County War in New Mexico was frankly incredibly convoluted. The rapid escalation of revenge killings essentially transformed a young participant named William Bonney into the legendary Billy the Kid. It all started when an Englishman named John Tunstall was murdered in cold blood. In retaliation, a group known as the Regulators, which included Bonnie, killed Sheriff Brady. The ensuing chaos saw Bonnie escaping jails, negotiating for amnesty with the territorial governor, and eventually being hunted down and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. So here's the real kicker. This legendary Wild West shootout wasn't some noble duel between pure heroes and villains. It was a violent conflict sparked entirely by unchallenged greed and corporate monopoly. A faction known as the House, run by James Dolan and Lawrence Murphy, completely controlled the only general store, backed the local government, and held all the beef contracts. When competitors tried to break their chokehold, they used the law and outlaw gangs to crush them. Billy the Kid wasn't a lone wolf. He was basically a foot soldier in a ruthless corporate turf war. But East Coast newspapers heavily sensationalized his exploits, forging the press-engineered myth of the rugged Western outlaw, really just to sell more papers. Section 5, Chicago's infamous gangster era, the untouchable gangster. Let's fast forward to the roaring 1920s in Chicago. The entire nation was gripped by suspense on February 14, 1929, wondering if the daylight butchering of 7 men in a grimy Chicago garage was a police job, a setup, or the work of the notorious Al Capone. 2 of the assailants were actually dressed as uniformed police officers. They lined up 7 members of the rival Bugs Moran gang and just executed them. The sheer audacity of the crime shocked the nation and highlighted the absolute ruthless power struggle over the illegal liquor trade in Chicago. Since nobody was ever actually charged with the massacre, the mystery just supercharged Capone's pop culture engineered myth. He was seen as a dark, untouchable godfather who held the Windy City captive. Now, at the exact time those machine guns were firing in Chicago, Capone was conveniently vacationing at his home in Florida. The absolute lack of convictions showed how seemingly helpless the city of Chicago was against the mob. Capone wasn't just a criminal. He was this enigmatic underworld figure who ran legitimate businesses as a front and actively cultivated influence with politicians and law enforcement. But the historically accurate reality of his downfall? It is wonderfully anticlimactic. Get this. The FBI finally took down the most infamous gangster in American history simply for tax evasion. Yep, they couldn't pin the Valentine's Day massacre on him, so the U.S. Treasury aggressively pursued him for unpaid taxes on his immense illegal wealth. Capone pled guilty, totally expecting a light sentence, but was handed a crushing 11 years in federal prison. That big dramatic shootout with the untouchable mob boss, it never happened. He was ultimately defeated by accountants. And that brings us to our final section, Section 6, History Beyond the Legend, What We Choose to Remember. History is, well, it's incredibly complex. But these heavily romanticized myths we tell ourselves, they reveal exactly what we value as a culture. We crave the noble founder, so we casually overlook Washington's military blunders to celebrate a self-engineered hero. We love the lone rebel, so we elevate a foot soldier in a corporate turf war into the press-engineered legend of Billy the Kid. We are fascinated by power, so we let pop culture mythologize a ruthless mobster who was, in reality, brought down by tax paperwork. Which leaves us with a final, really fascinating thought to ponder. If we have spent centuries twisting the truth to engineer these legends, what modern myths are we writing right now? When future historians look back at our era, which of our current facts will turn out to be nothing more than carefully constructed folklore? Keep questioning the story, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.